Welcome to another episode of our video series of the Philosophical History with Contemporary Critique. Hello, it's great to be back. How are things on your side today?
Very stimulating, thank you. The current intellectual atmosphere is, well, it's always ripe for this kind of exploration.
It really is.
And the sources you've laid out for us today, they take us right to the absolute core of human thought.
They certainly do. I mean, we're focusing on what seems like a simple, almost poetic idea, the philosophy of universal change.
The river image.
Exactly. Crystallized perfectly in that famous image. It's an idea that arguably defines Western philosophy, but it's also one we constantly try to argue our way out of.
Absolutely. We're talking about that notion that everything flows. You know, the ancient saying that you cannot step into the same river twice. And on the surface, that's just a physical observation. Water molecules are rushing past, okay. But philosophically, it suggests the entire universe is in a state of permanent, relentless flux.
Everything, from atoms to societies to our own identities.
Everything.
And this is where the paradox kicks in for me. Because, we can intellectually agree with this. We know the Earth is spinning at 1,000 miles an hour.
Right, and hurtling around the sun.
But our primal experience, let's say our brain's operating system, it indexes everything to stability. We don't feel the motion at all. We just feel the floor under our feet as completely fixed.
Exactly. Our ability to even function requires us to constantly impose a static frame on a dynamic reality.
So it's a necessary illusion.
A massive one and a successful one. I mean, think about a shadow on a wall. It looks motionless.
Yeah.
But the sun is moving, so the shadow is always imperceptibly shifting. And the Earth is moving, so the wall is moving. Our whole lived reality is built on this illusion of stillness, just so we can, put one foot in front of the other.
It's just fascinating that our basic factory settings are designed to contradict reality itself. So our mission today, then, is to really get into the radical consequences of accepting that.
The ethical, the psychological.
All of it. The rational fallout of fully embracing total change, and also why the arguments for fixed points are so powerful, so necessary for civilization, really.
It is the defining tension of consciousness, the flow versus the form.
Let's start with the ethical side, because this is where it immediately gets a little dark. If everything is constantly changing, if I am a fundamentally different person from one minute to the next, then the easiest moral defense for anything is just water under the bridge.
Yesterday was yesterday.
Right. Today is a new me, and I'm unburdened by what that other guy promised.
And that perspective, it's a kind of radical skepticism. And it instantly collapses the common ground you need for society to function, for justice, for agreement.
How can you have a contract?
You can't. If the person who signed it is no longer the same individual today, accountability just evaporates.
You'd end up in a situation where the strong just dominate the weak by constantly redefining the terms.
Or using the excuse of flux to shift the blame, always. And this goes beyond just promises. It's about how we even perceive reality. The sources remind us that our perception is heavily filtered. Someone shouts Marco. A child might only hear, "Go!"
Why? Because we're conditioned to structure reality, to emphasize certain things. We don't just passively absorb chaos.
We impose structure on the noise.
We have to.
Which brings up that classic sophist example, right? The wine. It tastes sweet if you're healthy, but bitter if you're sick.
Exactly. My subjective experience changes. So if I argue that the wine is objectively bitter just because I perceive it that way,
then reality is completely fractured. There's no common ground.
Precisely. And if you follow that logic of pure flux to its self-destructive end, some thinkers allegedly said you can't even step into the same river once.
Not even once.
No, because even in that single moment of immersion, both you and the water are already changing.
Wow. And that's where the rational need for fixed points really comes in. Because the argument for total change, it starts to sound self-refuting.
It is.
If you state, as a universal law, everything changes and nothing is fixed, well, that statement itself is a fixed rule. It's a foundational contradiction. The moment you define an unchangeable truth about life, even if that truth is unchangeableness, you've just used a fixed category to deny that fixed categories exist.
You've dropped an intellectual anchor to deny the existence of anchors.
A perfect way to put it, and that's why we have to bring in the powerful counterpoint.
The Parmenidean tradition.
Yes, the argument that actually change and movement are the illusions, that all existence is fundamentally one, constant.
For Parmenides, movement wasn't really possible, was it?
Not logically, no. He argued that for something to move, it has to move from being into non-being or from non-being into being. But you can't think about nothingness. You can't speak of it, so it can't exist.
So there's no void for a change to happen in.
Exactly. What is simply is. All the variations we see are superficial. The path going up is the same as the path going down. It's one path, just viewed differently.
And that idea underpins everything, because we can only measure motion from a fixed reference point.
Think about Archimedes. Give me a place to stand and I will move the world.
The place to stand has to be stable.
It has to be stable. In physics, you need a stable frame of reference. Even in our own bodies, our joints need stability to act as levers to create movement. If your elbow was liquid, you couldn't apply force.
So stability, even if it's an illusion on a cosmic scale, is the prerequisite for any meaningful action.
Or meaningful thought. Which brings us back to the idea of the forms.
The Platonic or Aristotelian idea of the stable reference point, the ultimate category.
Absolutely. When you look at an animal and say that's a cat, you're not just describing the specific old purring cat in front of you. You are referencing a stable, fixed template of catness.
And this happens in science, too.
All the time. When a biologist wants to cure a sick cell, they're operating from a fixed reference image of what a healthy cell is supposed to look like. Without that stable idea, all we see is just chaotic, meaningless difference.
So our reliance on stability isn't just a rational tool. It's also, it bleeds into our psychological coping mechanisms. If we're always seeking stable reference points, then any deviation, a personal trauma, a global crisis, gets flagged as an abnormal situation, something that has to pass quickly.
And that creates enormous impatience and anxiety. It's the psychological trap of the fixed reference. We internalize this expectation of a perfect, predictable order.
So when that order gets disrupted,
the need for normality to return takes over. It becomes this anxious, almost panic demand. When will this end? When can I go back to how things were?
But the problem is, the self you were before the crisis, that person is also gone. They float away with the river.
And that dual loss creates immense psychological fragility. You're demanding a return to a stable state that no longer exists, for a self that is no longer present.
I remember reading something about this in, I think, film theory.
Yes. When discussing depictions of catastrophe, the most resilient characters are often the ones who never fully bought into the system of fixed order in the first place.
How does that actually look in practice?
Well, imagine two people facing a sudden, prolonged economic depression. One person has spent their whole life believing in the guaranteed stability of the market, the predictable upward path of progress.
Okay.
When the system collapses, their entire worldview is shattered. They demand an immediate return to that fixed reality, which leads to this paralyzing anxiety.
And the other person?
The other, maybe someone who grew up with instability, who never had the luxury of expecting perfect order. They see the crisis not as a catastrophic interruption, but just as a new, difficult phase of life.
They accept chaos as part of the deal.
Exactly. Their psychological investment wasn't in that fragile idea of a perfectly fixed system. So when the rug gets pulled, they still have an internal reference point to stand on.
So the tightrope we all have to walk is acknowledging the truth of change, the Heraclitean view, while understanding that we need the architecture of stability, the Parmenidean view, to build a functioning life.
And the tool we use for that balancing act is critical reason. We have to distinguish our two main faculties here. On one hand, you have reason, or akko. It seeks structure, boundaries. On the other, you have desire, arzu, our emotions, appetites, our chaotic energy.
And arzu is inherently unstable, I take it.
Completely. Think of fear or greed as an insatiable fire. It has no internal stop button. It's fundamentally unaware of its own limits. It has to be contained from the outside.
But reason, akul, can contain itself.
It has that unique capacity. It can not only set boundaries, but it can also self-reflect and question its own boundaries.
And we should probably distinguish between two forms of reason.
Yes. The first is what you might call arrogant reason. This is the classic rationalist view. It insists that everything eventually can be reduced to a fixed, perfect system. It basically denies anything chaotic or subjective exists outside its definitions. It tries to conquer arzu.
Which is a fool's errand most of the time.
It often is. Reality spills over. And that leads us to the second type, mature or reflexive reason. This is reason that accepts its own limitations. It acknowledges the existence of the chaotic, of arzu, outside of its control.
It knows what it doesn't know.
Exactly. It recognizes that some things simply are. This sounds less like intellectual surrender and more like intellectual humility.
That's the perfect way to put it.
It allows for a state of acceptance. In some traditions, it's called saying I vala. For an English-speaking audience, that doesn't mean fatalistic resignation. It means a reasoned acknowledgement of what is necessary.
It's the wisdom to say, I've applied my reason, I've structured what I can, but this part is beyond my control and I accept it as part of reality.
That acceptance is incredibly powerful. It allows you to keep building your structure even when chaos is right next door.
Let's just go back to the basic laws of thought for a second. Identity, non-contradiction. These are not arbitrary rules we choose to follow.
No, they're the inescapable structures we are already using when we think. They're the fixed points on which thought rests.
Even when you're criticizing them.
Even then, you have to use the structure of fixed language to formulate your provocation. Critical reason is the only tool we have that can question its own assumptions. And that's what makes it so essential for survival in a world of flux.
This has been a profound synthesis, but let's bring it back to the listener. If we accept this complex web of flux and fixed ideas, what practical difference does it make when you wake up tomorrow and have to make a choice? Say, where to travel or where to invest your energy?
See, the value of real philosophical inquiry isn't to provide you with fake content or easy solutions. It's not a checklist for a morning routine.
Right.
Its value is to force you to confront what we could call the terribleness of the now, that immediate moment of decision and the immense weight of responsibility that comes with it.
The terror of the now demanding a choice.
Exactly. It requires a conscious application of a kul over arzu. It requires you to step out of the current. And this brings us right back to identity and individuality. We tend to assume we start as conscious, separate individuals, and then maybe we lapse into a herd mentality.
Right.
Philosophy suggests the opposite might be true. We begin in a state of inattention. We start as inseparable drops in the collective stream, part of the herd, driven by collective desire.
So true individuality isn't the starting point.
No. True, responsible individuality is what you achieve only when you show the profound courage to use that reflexive reason to consciously separate yourself from the collective flow.
So the choice of where to travel tomorrow or what action to take, it isn't just a preference, it's an act of separation. A declaration that you're not just being carried by the current.
You're consciously applying your fixed internal reference point to plot a new course.
Yeah.
It's the difference between being an object carried by the flow and becoming a subject actively rowing.
That conscious separation is the only stable ground we really have.
It is.
A truly powerful conclusion to our look at this ultimate philosophical paradox. Thank you for guiding us through it.
My pleasure. Something for you to consider next time you feel the current pulling you along.